You think your job is weird? Try explaining to someone that you're a professional influencer or a blockchain consultant. But here's the thing. Medieval people had jobs that sound absolutely insane until you realize they were actually solving problems we still have today. We're talking about careers that were so ahead of their time, they make modern innovation look like we're just catching up to the Middle Ages. Jobs that were bizarre, brilliant, and honestly, we desperately need them back. So buckle up, because you're about to discover 13 medieval occupations that will make you question everything you thought you knew about the Dark Ages. You've heard of breaking news alerts, push notifications, and viral tweets, but what if you lived in a world where most people couldn't read, and the only way to spread news quickly was with lungs of steel and a bell? Meet the town crier, the original news anchor, walking megaphone, and public broadcast system all rolled into one. Town criers were the heartbeat of medieval communication. Dressed in bright official uniforms, think high visibility before it was trendy, they'd march into village squares ringing a handbell, then project the latest royal decrees, market updates, law changes, and local dramas, loud enough to wake up anyone dozing at the back. If you missed what the crier said, you'd miss out on government edicts, lost pet notices, or tomorrow's parade. But here's where it gets genius. The town crier wasn't just shouting in the street, they were a trusted source, carefully vetted and sworn to deliver news accurately. They had to memorize complex announcements, interpret sometimes vague or contradictory decrees, and even read the room to know whether to soften harsh news or ramp up enthusiasm for a royal festival. And if someone interrupted, the crier could have them fined. Imagine muting trolls in real life. The crier's job required charisma, a huge memory, and serious diplomacy. They were part news anchor, part government spokesperson, part local celebrity. Got a grievance? You'd bring it to the crier, who could sometimes act as your advocate with city officials. What's wild is that medieval society got around the literacy barrier not with more schools, but by appointing one person with a loud voice and the authority to be heard, someone who brought the news to you while you shopped, worked, or socialized. So the next time you scroll past an official bulletin, picture a medieval crier, bell in hand, voice echoing off stone walls, making sure everyone's in on the latest twist. Maybe we need a modern revival. Forget the email blast. Just send in a crier with a megaphone and a killer announcement outfit. Now imagine a world before streetlights, where nights were truly dark and danger waited in every shadow. Enter the lamplighter, the unsung hero of public safety, urban comfort, and after-hours city life. Long before electricity, city streets were lit by oil lamps or candles placed atop posts or inside lanterns attached to buildings. It was the lamplighter's job to make sure every one of these beacons was burning bright by dusk. Armed with a long pole, sometimes with a wick trimmer or snuffer, a supply of fuel, and the keys to the city's collective sense of safety, the lamplighter moved from lamp to lamp, bringing light to the darkness. But this wasn't just flipping a switch. The lamplighter had to brave weather, climb ladders, balance on cobblestones, and sometimes fend off stray dogs or rowdy citizens. Each evening they'd light every lamp, sometimes relighting ones that had gone out during the night. Before dawn, they'd return to snuff the flames, refill oil, and clean the glass, inventing the daily maintenance routine centuries ahead of modern utility workers. The genius part? Lamplighters extended the life of cities after sunset, making it safe for night markets, travelers, and community gatherings. They were walking, breathing security systems whose job it was to literally drive away the dark. Lamplighters quickly became local characters. People knew them by name, timed their errands to their evening rounds, and even passed them little favors for lighting the way home. In a society obsessed with accidents, thieves, and lurking ghosts, the lamplighter represented peace of mind. Think about it. Without reliable street lighting, civilization goes to sleep at sundown. With lamplighters, cities became 24-hour places centuries before nightlife was invented. We owe our modern evenings, and maybe our best urban adventures, to these determined souls with flames and poles. Maybe it's time to bring back lamplighters, roaming neighborhoods, fixing broken lights, and literally brightening up the night shift. Let's talk about the gong farmer. And no, they didn't farm gongs. They cleaned out latrines, and before you say gross, hear me out. These people were running the world's first waste management and recycling program. Gong farmers worked at night, removing human waste from public and private latrines. But here's the genius part. They didn't just throw it away. They sold it to farmers as fertilizer. Medieval people had figured out the circular economy centuries before we gave it a fancy name. These weren't just medieval janitors. They were licensed professionals who made serious money, sometimes more than skilled craftsmen. They wore special clothes, worked specific hours, and had strict regulations about where they could and couldn't go. The licensing system was incredibly sophisticated. Gong farmers had to prove their competence, follow health protocols, and maintain professional standards. They couldn't work during daylight hours to avoid offending people, couldn't live within city limits for obvious reasons, and had to dispose of waste in designated areas only. The job was so important that Gong farmers were often exempt from certain taxes and had special legal protections. Society recognized that without them, cities would literally drown in their own waste. But here's what's really incredible. They were early environmental scientists. Good Gong farmers could tell you about the health of a community just by examining its waste. They could detect disease outbreaks, identify dietary problems, and even spot signs of prosperity or poverty. Compare this to today. We flush our toilets and never think about where it goes. We've got water treatment plants and complex sewer systems, but we've lost the connection between waste and resources. Medieval Gong farmers understood that everything is connected. They also had incredible job security. No matter what was happening in the world, war, plague, economic collapse, people were always going to need waste management. Gong farmers were recession-proof, plus they were probably the most honest people in medieval society. When your job is literally dealing with everyone's crap, you don't have time for small talk or office politics. Just result. Medieval people took their beer seriously. So seriously, in fact, that they hired professional beer tasters to make sure brewers weren't cutting corners. And before you think dream job, these people were basically food safety inspectors with a very specific skill set. Beer tasters didn't just sip and say, "tastes good." They tested for strength, purity, and whether brewers were using the right ingredients. They could detect watered-down beer, contaminated batches, and brewing shortcuts that could make people sick. Here's the genius part. They were protecting public health at a time when beer was safer to drink than water. Beer tasters were literally keeping people alive by making sure their daily beverage wasn't poison. The training to become a beer taster was intense. They had to develop their palate to detect subtle differences in taste, learn about brewing processes, understand the properties of different grains and hops, and memorize the standards for different types of beer. They had standardized testing procedures, official certifications, and the authority to shut down breweries that didn't meet standards. Medieval people had created a quality control system that modern craft breweries would recognize. But beer tasters weren't just about enforcement. They were also consultants. They helped brewers improve their recipes, suggested new techniques, and shared knowledge about what worked and what didn't. They were part inspector, part advisor, part teacher. The economic impact was huge. Bad beer could destroy a brewery's reputation overnight, and in a world where beer was a daily necessity, that was a death sentence. Beer tasters protected both consumers and businesses by maintaining standards. Today, we've got food safety inspectors, but they're spread thin across thousands of different products. Medieval beer tasters were specialists who knew everything about one crucial product that everyone consumed daily. They also understood something we've forgotten. Quality control isn't just about meeting minimum standards. It's about continuous improvement. The best beer tasters pushed brewers to innovate and create better products. Imagine if we had wine tasters for mass-produced wine, or coffee tasters for chain coffee shops. Someone whose only job was to make sure your daily drink wasn't terrible. We'd probably have better beer, better coffee, and fewer people pretending to enjoy things that taste like disappointment. The pardoner sold forgiveness. Literally. They traveled from town to town with official documents that would reduce your time in purgatory. And while this sounds like a scam, they were actually providing something people desperately needed: peace of mind. Medieval people lived with constant anxiety about death and the afterlife. The pardoner offered relief from that psychological burden. They were essentially therapists who specialized in guilt and existential dread. But here's where it gets interesting. Good pardoners didn't just take money and run. They listened to people's problems, offered counseling, and helped them work through their issues. They were combining spiritual guidance with emotional support. The psychological techniques they used were surprisingly sophisticated. Pardoners understood that people need to confess their problems to someone, that guilt can be physically and mentally destructive, and that forgiveness, even purchased forgiveness, can provide real relief. They understood that people need to feel forgiven, whether by God or by themselves. The pardoner gave people permission to move on from their mistakes, something we still struggle with today. The really clever ones were also skilled at reading people. They could tell who was genuinely struggling with guilt versus who was just going through the motions. They adjusted their approach accordingly, providing deeper counseling for those who needed it. Modern therapy can cost hundreds of dollars per session. Medieval pardoners made forgiveness accessible to everyone, with payment plans and sliding scales. They democratized mental health support. Sure, some were frauds, but the best ones were doing real psychological work. They helped people process trauma, move past regret, and find hope for the future. That's not a scam, that's healing. They also served as informal social workers. Pardoners often connected people with resources, helped resolve family disputes, and provided support during difficult times. They were one-stop shops for emotional and spiritual needs. We could use modern pardoners, people who help others forgive themselves and move forward. Not religious authorities, but emotional support specialists who understand that sometimes people just need permission to let go. The court fool wasn't just entertainment. They were the only person who could tell the king he was being an idiot, and that made them one of the most important people in medieval society. Fools had a unique social position that allowed them to speak truth to power through humor. They could criticize the king's policies, point out corruption, and highlight social problems, all while making people laugh. This wasn't just comedy, it was political commentary with built-in protection. The fool could say things that would get anyone else executed because they were just joking. But everyone understood the real message. The skill required to be a successful fool was enormous. They had to be intelligent enough to understand complex political situations, clever enough to package criticism as humor, and brave enough to say things that could get them killed if they went too far. Medieval fools were essentially investigative journalists, political satirists, and social critics, all rolled into one. They kept powerful people honest by making dishonesty look ridiculous, but they weren't just about criticism. They were also problem solvers. Good fools didn't just point out what was wrong, they suggested solutions through their jokes and stories. They were consultants disguised as entertainers. They also served as emotional release valves for society. People could laugh at their problems, feel less alone in their struggles, and see their leaders as human beings with flaws. The relationship between fool and ruler was complex and intimate. The best fools became trusted advisors who could speak privately with their patrons about serious issues. They were part therapist, part friend, part conscience. Today we've got late-night talk show hosts, political comedians, and social media influencers doing similar work. But they don't have the same protection or access that medieval fools had. The modern equivalent might be corporate consultants, but they're usually telling leaders what they want to hear rather than what they need to hear. Medieval fools were paid to be uncomfortable truth-tellers. Imagine if every CEO had a company fool whose job was to point out bad decisions through humor. Board meetings would be more honest. Corporate culture would be healthier, and maybe we'd have fewer business scandals. The raker kept medieval streets clean, and they were way more sophisticated than you'd think. These weren't just people with brooms. They were urban maintenance specialists who understood how cities worked. Rakers collected garbage, animal waste, and debris from streets. But they also monitored drainage, identified health hazards, and reported problems to city officials. They were the eyes and ears of municipal government. The genius part? They turned waste into income. Rakers sold organic waste to farmers, recycled materials to craftsmen, and even collected valuable items that people had thrown away. They were running the world's first urban recycling program. The classification system they used was incredibly detailed. Rakers knew the difference between different types of waste, what could be recycled, what was dangerous, and what was valuable. They were waste management scientists. They worked on schedules, had assigned routes, and maintained equipment. Medieval cities had figured out systematic waste management that many modern cities still struggle with. But rakers were more than just cleaners. They were urban diagnosticians. They could tell you about the health of a neighborhood, predict where problems might occur, and spot trends that city officials missed. They also served as neighborhood watchmen. They knew every street, every building, and every person. They could spot problems early and alert authorities to everything from fires to crime to disease outbreaks. The economic impact was significant. Clean streets meant healthier communities, which meant more productive workers and less disease. Rakers were essentially public health workers who prevented problems before they started. Modern street cleaners do important work, but they're often invisible and undervalued. Medieval rakers were respected members of society who were essential to urban life. The job also required physical fitness, route optimization skills, and the ability to work in all weather conditions. Rakers were basically medieval urban athletes who kept cities running. We need to bring back the raker mentality, seeing waste as a resource, understanding that cleanliness is connected to health, and recognizing that the people who maintain our cities are heroes, not just employees. Medieval herbalists were running the world's first integrated healthcare system. They grew their own medicines, diagnosed illnesses, and treated patients with natural remedies that actually worked. These weren't just people who picked plants. Herbalists understood complex chemical interactions, had extensive knowledge of human anatomy, and could create targeted treatments for specific conditions. The training was incredibly rigorous. Herbalists had to learn botany, chemistry, anatomy, and pharmacology. They studied with master practitioners, memorized thousands of plant properties, and practiced for years before treating patients independently. They maintained detailed records of what worked for different ailments, experimented with new combinations, and shared knowledge with other herbalists. They were essentially conducting clinical trials centuries before modern medicine. The genius part? They treated the whole person, not just symptoms. Herbalists considered diet, lifestyle, emotional state, and environment when creating treatment plans. They understood that health is holistic. They also made medicine accessible. While trained physicians were expensive and rare, herbalists served entire communities. They offered affordable care, house calls, and preventive medicine. The range of conditions they treated was enormous. Herbalists dealt with everything from headaches to broken bones, from childbirth to mental illness. They were general practitioners who specialized in natural medicine, but they weren't just healers, they were also teachers. Herbalists educated people about nutrition, hygiene, and healthy living. They helped communities understand how to prevent illness rather than just treat it. Many modern pharmaceuticals are based on compounds that herbalists discovered and refined. They laid the foundation for everything from aspirin to antibiotics. The relationship between herbalist and patient was deeply personal. They knew their patients' families, histories, and individual needs. Treatment was customized and ongoing. We've gained a lot with modern medicine, but we've lost the personal touch and holistic approach that herbalists provided. Maybe we need to bring back the neighborhood herbalist, someone who knows you, your family, and your health history. Before printing presses, there were scribes, but these weren't just medieval copy machines. They were information management specialists who preserved and transmitted human knowledge. Scribes didn't just copy text. They corrected errors, improved formatting, added illustrations, and sometimes enhanced the original work. They were editors, publishers, and librarians all in one. The skill level required was extraordinary. Scribes had to have perfect penmanship, understand multiple languages, know different writing systems, and be familiar with various subjects. They were intellectual athletes. They worked in scriptoriums, medieval think tanks where scholars collaborated on projects, shared resources, and pushed the boundaries of knowledge. These were the Google campuses of the Middle Ages. The genius part? Scribes created the world's first quality control system for information. They fact-checked, cross-referenced, and verified sources. They were fighting fake news centuries before it had a name. But they weren't just copiers, they were also interpreters. Scribes often had to translate between languages, update archaic terms, and make old texts accessible to new audiences. They were bridge builders between different cultures and time periods. They also democratized knowledge. By copying books, scribes made information available to more people and helped preserve it for future generations. They were running the world's first open-source knowledge project. The economic model was sophisticated. Scribes worked for monasteries, universities, wealthy patrons, and commercial scriptoriums. They understood different markets and adjusted their work accordingly. The attention to detail was incredible. Scribes developed techniques for consistent spacing, perfect letter formation, and beautiful illumination. They were artists as well as information professionals. Modern technology has made copying easier, but we've lost the careful curation that scribes provided. Maybe we need digital scribes, people who verify information, improve clarity, and help organize the chaos of online content. The summoner delivered legal documents and court summons. But they were way more than medieval mailmen. They were psychological warfare specialists who used intimidation and theatrics to get results. Summoners understood that half of legal enforcement is showing up in a way that makes people take you seriously. They dressed dramatically, spoke with authority, and created an atmosphere of consequences. The psychology was sophisticated. Summoners knew that most people would comply with legal requirements if they understood the seriousness of the situation. They were masters of persuasion who could make people want to cooperate. They were also skilled negotiators who could often resolve disputes without going to court. Summoners knew that most people would rather settle than face public trial, and they used that knowledge to broker deals. The genius part? They combined legal knowledge with people skills. Summoners understood both the law and human psychology. They could explain complex legal situations in ways that regular people could understand. But they weren't just intimidation specialists. They were also counselors. Good summoners helped people understand their options, explained the consequences of different choices, and guided them toward reasonable solutions. They also served as informal mediators, helping people work through conflicts before they escalated. Many disputes were resolved simply because the summoner showed up and helped people communicate. The job required courage, intelligence, and excellent communication skills. Summoners often dealt with angry, scared, or desperate people. They had to diffuse tense situations while still getting their job done. The travel aspect was significant. Summoners covered large territories, knew multiple communities, and understood regional differences in law and custom. They were legal ambassadors who connected different jurisdictions. Modern process servers do similar work, but they're often just delivery people. Medieval summoners were legal professionals who understood that enforcement is about more than just paperwork. The Fletcher made arrows, and they were basically running medieval precision manufacturing operations. These weren't just people who stuck feathers on sticks. They were engineers who understood aerodynamics, material science, and quality control. Fletchers had to balance weight, flexibility, and durability to create arrows that would fly straight and hit hard. They worked with wood, metal, and feathers to create products that met exact specifications. The level of precision was incredible. Fletchers measured everything: the diameter of the shaft, the weight of the point, the angle of the feathers, the depth of the nock. A tiny variation could mean the difference between hitting a target and missing completely. They also understood their customers. Fletchers knew that different archers needed different arrows, and they customized their products for specific uses. They were running the world's first mass customization operation. The genius part? They were constantly innovating. Fletchers experimented with new materials, tested different designs, and improved their products based on feedback from users. They were doing R&D centuries before it was a thing. The supply chain management was complex. Fletchers had to source wood from foresters, points from blacksmiths, and feathers from hunters. They had to manage inventory, predict demand, and coordinate with multiple suppliers. They also understood supply chain management. Fletchers had to source materials from multiple suppliers, manage inventory, and meet deadlines. They were running complex businesses that modern manufacturers would recognize. Quality control was paramount. A defective arrow could mean death in battle or failure in a hunt. Fletchers tested their products rigorously and stood behind their work with their reputation. The skill transfer was important too. Master Fletchers trained apprentices, shared techniques, and maintained craft standards. They were running the world's first professional development programs. We need to bring back the Fletcher mentality, attention to detail, continuous improvement, and understanding that small differences in manufacturing can have huge impacts on performance. Traveling merchants were the world's first international business people. They moved goods across continents, navigated complex trade regulations, and built relationships with people from completely different cultures. These weren't just people with stuff to sell. Traveling merchants were diplomats, translators, and cultural ambassadors who helped connect different parts of the world. They were running the world's first global network. The logistics were mind-boggling. Merchants had to plan routes that could take months or years, arrange protection for their caravans, and coordinate with suppliers and customers across vast distances. They were master project managers. They understood that trade is about more than just buying and selling. Merchants also exchanged ideas, technologies, and cultural practices. They were spreading innovation along with goods. The genius part? They were master risk managers. Traveling merchants had to deal with bandits, weather, political upheaval, and market fluctuations. They developed strategies that modern investors still use. Language skills were crucial. Successful merchants spoke multiple languages, understood different currencies, and could navigate various legal systems. They were walking Google Translate devices. They also understood customer service. Merchants built long-term relationships with suppliers and customers. They knew that reputation was everything in international trade. The financing was sophisticated. Merchants developed credit systems, insurance policies, and investment partnerships. They were creating the foundation of modern international finance. The cultural impact was enormous. Traveling merchants introduced new foods, technologies, and ideas to different regions. They were agents of globalization who helped create the interconnected world we live in today. Modern e-commerce has made global trade easier, but we've lost the personal relationships and cultural understanding that traveling merchants provided. Maybe we need to bring back the human element in global business. The minstrel was way more than a medieval entertainer. They were the world's first multimedia content creators. They combined music, storytelling, and news reporting into packages that informed and entertained audiences. Minstrels traveled from town to town, carrying news, sharing stories, and providing entertainment. They were basically running the world's first news network, using songs and stories to make information memorable. The skill set was enormous. Minstrels had to be musicians, storytellers, comedians, and journalists all at once. They had to memorize vast amounts of information and present it in engaging ways. They understood that people learn better when they're entertained. Minstrels packaged complex information into engaging formats that people would remember and share. They were doing viral marketing centuries before social media. The genius part? They were also preserving culture. Minstrels kept oral traditions alive, documented historical events, and helped communities maintain their identity. They were living libraries. But they weren't just entertainers. They were also educators. Minstrels taught people about history, morality, and proper behavior through their songs and stories. They were running medieval TED Talks. They also understood their audience. Minstrels adapted their performances based on who they were entertaining. They were skilled at reading the room and adjusting their content accordingly. The economic model was flexible. Minstrels worked for noble patrons, performed at festivals, and collected donations from audiences. They understood different revenue streams and diversified their income. The social impact was significant. Minstrels helped create shared cultural experiences, spread important information, and provided emotional release for communities. They were social media before social media existed. Modern content creators are doing similar work, but they're often isolated behind screens. Medieval minstrels had direct contact with their audiences and could respond to feedback in real time. So there you have it. 12 medieval jobs that were way ahead of their time. These people weren't living in the Dark Ages. They were solving problems with creativity, innovation, and common sense that would make modern entrepreneurs jealous. They understood that work should serve society, that specialization creates value, and that the best jobs combine technical skills with human connection. They were building systems that lasted for centuries and created the foundation for everything we take for granted today. We've gained a lot with modern technology, but we've lost some of the wisdom that medieval workers had. They understood their communities, took pride in their craft, and saw their work as essential to society rather than just a paycheck. These medieval professionals were pioneers who created entire industries, developed sophisticated systems, and solved complex problems with limited resources. They were innovators who understood that the best solutions are often simple, sustainable, and human-centered. Maybe it's time to bring back some of these medieval jobs, not exactly as they were, but adapted for modern needs. The Middle Ages weren't as backward as we thought. In many ways, they were more forward-thinking than we are. They created jobs that solved real problems, served real needs, and made society better for everyone. Your medieval ancestors weren't just surviving, they were innovating, creating, and building the world we inherited. And maybe it's time we learned from them instead of assuming we know better. Who knows? Maybe your dream job is actually a medieval job that's waiting to be rediscovered. The world needs more people who understand that work is about more than just making money. It's about making life better for everyone. The past isn't dead. It's just waiting for us to remember what it had to teach us. And maybe, just maybe, the future of work looks a lot like the past, but with better tools and wider reach. These medieval workers understood something we've forgotten, that the best jobs are the ones that make the world a little bit better every day. And that's a lesson worth remembering no matter what century we're living in.